Is that right? Is that your job? Is that you're one of those people?
Our next presentation is Jack Bernatovicz. His presentation is Democratic Representation of Communities Through Public Art Policy.
Hi everybody, my name is Jack Bernatovicz, and for my CEP capstone, I'm looking at the democratic representation of people and communities through public art policy. So for the project itself, the main things I was trying to ask are how are communities represented in current planning of the public art? What can be done by the City of Seattle to be more accountable and representational of the communities they're working for, as well as what can I do to help make this change? For the senior project, I wanted to look into public art. This is my focus in CEP. My interests lie in planning, policy, community engagement, and the arts, and how all of them work together. And this project allowed me to explore those things in one project. So first off, as an outline of what I'm going to be talking about, first I'm going to be going through some definitions and the history of public art in the US. Methodologies, I did a comprehensive literature review and then an online objective survey, which led into a final product being a best practices document, and then results, best practices guide, and then I'll be talking about the significance of this overall. And for all the slides in the background are publicly funded pieces of public art. Definition, so public art, it is art in public places. It can range from murals to sculptures to memorials to just people out and about calling it art. For this project specifically, I will be looking at publicly funded public art. So art that is public art funded by the city government, national government, or municipality. So through taxpayer dollars. This excludes privately owned or nonprofit supported, so I'm not looking at the Seattle Arts Museum or any private gifts. So history of U.S. Publicly funded public art. It started with the 1930s in the WPA during the New Deal with the Federal Arts Project. This was an economic driver that created more than 90,000 pieces of public art during the Great Depression. Next, during the 1960s, the National Art and Culture Development Act, which created the National Endowment for the Arts, which is a national grant supporting national art projects or public art projects. Then in 1974, Seattle Mayor Wes Ullman introduced the Quality of Life in Our Cities resolution to the National Conference of U.S. Mayors, which led to a national priority around public art and cities supporting them, which led to many cities starting 1% for art programs, as well as creating their own arts and culture departments or arts commissions. And currently, 4 cities in the U.S. have created comprehensive culture plans. This is comprehensive long-term planning around arts and culture. And something that 4 cities, New York just created their new one. So it's still something cities are talking about. So in the city of Seattle, we have the Office of Arts and Cultures. They are the city authority around public art and arts and cultures. They were created in 1973 by Seattle Mayor Wes Ullman. He got it onto the budget and he created the Seattle Arts Commission, which started the 1% for Art program. Then in 1977, Arts Commission had their first piece of public art outside the Seattle Center, which is Mike Heiser's Adjacent Against the Pond, which is the image on the first slide. And then 2003, the Arts Commission split into Arts Commission and the Office of Arts and Cultures, creating 2 separate entities for this. Now for my project specifically, the methodology, I broke it up into 3 main parts. My literature review, which is a comprehensive review of policies and methodologies for public art planning and community engagement. Next, I did an objective survey online, giving people's responses to how they feel about public art and if they'd like to be involved in the planning of it, how so. And the final product is a best practices guide, which is recommendations for the Office of Arts and Cultures for ways to get more people involved in the process and the policies itself. So for the literature review, like I said before, I broke it up into 2 halves. I have public art planning policy, looking into the Office of Arts and Culture's 3 principal policies. The Public Art Ordinance, Municipal Art Plan, and the City of Seattle Standard Operating Procedures. And then for community engagement, I looked at 3 different city offices and 1 piece of theory. With the Office of Civil Rights, Parks and Recreation, Department of Planning and Development, and Sherry Arnstein's Ladder of Citizen Participation. So for the first piece of policy, looking at the Public Art Ordinance, this is the City of Seattle's creation of the Arts Commission and the Office of Arts and Cultures and set a priority for public art and arts and cultures within the city. It outlines the function and role of the office and the commission, and it does not focus primarily on community engagement, just the office existing itself. So it does not address inclusion of communities or constituents in the planning process, and so I will not be focusing on it as much. Then the municipal art plan. This is drafted by the Office of Arts and Culture every year, and this outlines the continuation of projects and introduction of new public art projects supported by the 1% for Art program. The 1% for Art program in the city of Seattle, 1% of all capital projects budgets go to public art. And so these are all administered and planned by the Office of Arts and Cultures. In this document, it focuses the vision of the entity as well as public art programs, focusing on the vision of the artist in the city department that they are partnering with for these projects. And they mention community participation, but they don't outline it. They just say we want to get the community involved, but don't say how or who they'll be working with specifically. And then finally, with the standard operating procedure, this document says how the Office of Arts and Culture is going to plan and implement different public art projects. With this one, it talks about how they're going to do all the projects in the municipal art plan. They define community groups and members as any person that wants to be involved. Not saying which community groups specifically, where they have to come from, what titles they need to have, or what voice they have. It just says they want to be involved in some way. It also has conflicting priorities with the neighborhood focus and the entity they'll be working with, or the mission of the utility entity. It also lacks specificity around community engagement and throughout all of it, and something that would help make it stronger. Now looking at community engagement methods, the first one I'll be looking at is the Office of Civil Rights. With their Inclusive Outreach and Public Engagement Guide. This guide is for the City of Seattle and all the departments to use to better involve the communities they're working with. And the main point I'll be focusing on, or the biggest takeaway I got out of it, is the first one right here: building strong and sustainable relationships with partnerships, and building trust in a relationship with the constituent communities the department is working with. Then with the Parks and Recreation and the Public Involvement Policy, this policy oversees how parks are planned and how public art is used in those as well. So this is a very strict policy that lays out everything. It says how far they must reach out to, how they engage communities, and all the steps they need to do to plan a park. So it's very strict, but it's very consistent and allows for consistency with all the different parks and projects, or capital projects Parks and Recreation is working with. Also includes all necessary stakeholders and constituents, lining out which departments to work with, which neighborhood groups to work with, and the such. Then with the Department of Planning and Development, with the public engagement methods, this was from their comprehensive plan and review in 2011, and they wanted to explore different ways to reach out to the community and engage them in the planning process. And so the main things this talked about, or main takeaways from this, is focusing on face-to-face conversations, as well as using new methods of outreach with electronic media, such as Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, used by the Department of Planning and Development. And with these new methods, and focusing more on the face-to-face and online, instead of just having public meetings and asking people to come to you, you create stronger relationships and ongoing relationships with your constituents. And now looking into the theory of it, with a ladder-assisted participation, I explored where the Office of Arts and Culture would be within this. And so on the bottom of the ladder is top down, so the city government would be working on top of the people. On the top would be bottom up, where the community is working kind of for the government as well, or that's how I perceive this. And with Office of Arts and Culture, they'd be right at a 5 with placation. So meaning that citizens there's some representation, it's not very clear how, not super consistent, but minority voices are still being limited and not heard in the process. So the next part after that literature review, I did an online survey, and these are the questions I asked. The main things I wanted to explore is if the Seattle community thought public art was important or beneficial, and if they'd like to be involved in the process. If interested in being involved, how? Let me know, and so I could share this with everybody else, as well as sharing comments, stories, or critiques, questions, or anything related to public art. I wanted to hear some more stories about it and get some more qualitative information. For the survey, I performed it through an online Google form. I shared it via Facebook, primarily through my own personal account, as well as working with the Office of Arts and Culture and their staff, and a community group called Arts and Social Change. It was open for 2 weeks. I got 49 responses, and it used to get objective feedback and perspective. So with the survey results, the first 2 questions focus on the importance and benefit. And so overall majority of the responses is people believe that is important and beneficial, but this could also be skewed by the people I asked, being part of an arts group, as well as the Office of Arts and Culture, and asking specific people. This information is still relevant, but you have to look at it with a careful eye. And then my final two questions is how interested would you be in the planning process? Majority of people said yes. And if so, how would they like to be involved? And more than half of the responses said social media or online survey. Some people did say public meeting. I also had another category, and in there a lot of people said don't involve the public at all. They don't know what they're talking about, to provide food or work with the youth. So a lot of people had a lot of different perspectives, but the overall majority was in their face already, so using online social media. So the results of the methodology with the literature review and the survey, the main takeaways are there's a lack of specificity in the current policy related to community engagement and public participation. And this leads to inconsistent engagement and the Office of Arts and Culture using different methods every time. There's a need for outlined role of the community and more definitions of who they are and how they're involved in the process. Also, the use for innovative engagement, so used by the Office or Department of Planning and Development, using social media and the internet more. There's intentional inclusive outreach, or also need for intentional inclusive outreach to build stronger relationships with constituent communities and neighborhoods. And through the survey, there's a general approval and interest in being involved with public art planning, as well as a strong interest in involvement through social media and using the internet. So my best practices document, which I will be delivering to the Office of Arts and Cultures in a few weeks. The three main things I'm recommending for them is to prioritize, to define, and create new methods. With priorities, I'm talking about prioritize the neighborhoods in the policy itself, make it clear that the mission and vision of the public art program in the office is for the people they're working for and the constituents they represent. For define, add more specific definitions, provide resources for different neighborhood groups to work with, as well as specifically how are you going to get people involved, outline the process, make it as clear as possible. And then for new media or new methods, that is encouraging the Office of Arts and Cultures to put in specific methods into their policies and explore different options that aren't traditionally used by city departments. So the significance of this whole thing, it takes a critical look at policies that aren't often looked at. Talking to the Office of Arts and Cultures and some of their staff members, they had to search to find these policies because they're not usually explored. It creates a first step for deeper investigation and deeper exploration around community representation through the arts. Also provides action steps for change. While the Office of Arts and Cultures could do their own analysis of this, create their own survey, explore the policies themselves, create their own recommendations, they could start working off of mine. And it also is a practice of citizen control and see what people believe would be a great way to be represented through the planning, and it's a good practice of that. So I'd like to thank the following: my mentor for this project, the Office of Arts and Cultures, the CEP staff, so people I interviewed, and my friends and family. Questions? And you can take a second. I'm going to drink some water.
I have a curiosity.
Yeah.
Although the Office of Arts and Culture oversees art in Seattle, do they actually generate art? Because it's my perception that they are a conduit, more of a conduit, and working with Sound Transit in particular, they did have an artist selection panel. Seattle Parks and Recreation, which you mentioned, their public art does an extensive community participatory, action. They have that action plan as a part of it. So, would the Office of Arts and Culture manage or oversee any actual installation of art or projects from the ground up?
So they partner with city departments and usually work based off of their methods, but this would create their own policy for any of their own projects. They do have a few with, I believe, Arts Interruption is something they do work with. That is seen over them, correct me if I'm wrong. But mostly they are partnerships with the rest of the city and other departments. But this would provide consistency. If a department didn't happen to have public outreach or engagement methods, this would allow them, or create those as well. Hopefully I answered your question.
Yes. I just made it up because it's so quiet.
That's probably fine.
So you conducted a survey and then you analyzed these documents?
Mhm.
And so it was a combination of the documents and the survey that produced the best practices, or was it simply from the responses of the survey?
It was a combination of the both. So with the results, I took the combination of what I got from the literature review and the objective survey to come up with these recommendations. And so the literature review, looking at the policy, more found the holes, what's not being done, or what is being done and what's not being done. Looking at community engagement methods, that was what could be done and what's being done elsewhere. And then the survey is, what do people want to be done, or would they be interested in this? If I got a ton of responses saying, no, I don't want to be involved, I wouldn't have recommended it because it's forcing something that people don't want to do.
Okay. So you learned then that the public, I can't remember what the group was, that had a really structured, rigorous process.
Oh, Parks and Recreation.
Parks and Recreation, their standard operating procedure was better, or at least more rigorous than another one, but that structure may not necessarily be the best way to go about it, so you were kind of plugging and playing from
Yes.
the various documents?
Mhm.
Okay. So the best practices then would be something that all of those groups could potentially benefit from, or was it?
It's more
Specifically
targeted
for-
for Office of Arts and Culture.
Okay.
Should be varied. I mean, Parks and Rec's different from arts and culture, is different from transportation. Expertise would be more or less important depending on the situation.
Yeah.
So is there something about arts that lends itself or doesn't lend itself to democracy? You know, like, you could say something like, well, the best art is art by a great artist
Yeah.
versus the best art is art by everyone together in the community painting a mural or something like that. But best practices seem to suggest that there's some value that guides what is good and what is not good. What constitutes best in the case of art, would you say?
So this is my perspective on this. With publicly funded public art, it should be representing the constituents and communities that are helping pay for it, and it's representing. So bringing in a great artist to put in a great work has some value to it, but I view that more as art in public space, not public art. Public art is a representational media or medium to represent people through a creative creative way. I don't know where my words are going. But with that, in the Office of Arts and Culture, since they do oversee this representational culture and art, they should be representing the people in the planning process as well. And with our transportation and Parks and Rec, they have their own mission guiding what they are doing, but arts and trying to figure out where I'm going. With arts and culture, they should be focused on the constituents themselves through the arts. So representing them in pieces. Yeah.
And move to the point of saying they should be doing public art and not art and culture,
Yes, that is more where I'm going.
which would involve literally people being the artists.
No, I do not believe so. It's them working together and having